Good morning and welcome to the Sunday morning sermon for June the 30th of 2024. And we've begun a series of messages that are going to take us through the summer and probably into the fall a little bit. We're studying the life of Moses, and we're into number 3 in this series, looking at the desert schooling of Moses. Last week, we learned from what we studied that when Moses stepped out on his own to become the deliverer of Israel, it was an unmitigated disaster for him. He ended up killing an Egyptian and then hiding the body in the sand. And in his failure, we saw that no matter how talented or how educated we might be, we still can do nothing without God. And we saw that we're capable of some terrible things if we persist in our own ways. And the third thing we discovered was that hiding our wrongs does not erase them, it only postpones their discovery. Verse 15, as we move on, Exodus chapter 2, verse 15, we're going to be looking at verses 15 through 25, but verse 15 tells us that when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. When we left Moses last Sunday, he had fled from Egypt into the desert of Midian, and we pick up the story beginning at verse 16, where it says, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water, and they filled the troughs with water to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. After traveling a long way across the desert, Moses sits down by a well, and while he's there, the 7 daughters of the priest of Midian came to water their father's flock. As they began drawing the water to fill the troughs, some shepherds came along and drove the ladies off, intending to use the water that they had already drawn to water their own flock. Moses, who noticed what was happening, it says he stood up and he helped them. I like to think that the words stood up in that verse have a double meaning. He not only stood up on his feet, but he stood up for and protected these young ladies. He helped them. He helped them by driving away the offending shepherds, and then he helped them to water their flock. Moses is already beginning to learn the lessons of servanthood out in the desert of Midian. Well, the young women returned to their home, where the scripture says in verse 18, when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "How is it that you have come so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he drew enough water for us to water the flock." So he said to his daughters, "And where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him, that he may eat my bread." Their father, who is called Reuel here, which means friend of God, is later called Jethro in chapter 3, verse 1. One of the names is probably the family name, and the other is his given name. Jethro wants to know why the daughters are back so early from watering the flock. And they told him an Egyptian had defended them from the shepherds and drew water for their flock and helped them to water the flock. And Jethro responded by saying, "Well, where is he? Why is it that you've left him behind? Go and get him, that he may come and share a meal with us." Their father greatly chastised his daughters for not extending hospitality to this kind stranger. who had helped them water their flock and helped them to drive off the offending shepherds. So the daughters go out and they bring Moses to their father. Moses then records here how his chance encounter at the well resulted in him staying there in Midian, his marriage, and the birth of his first son. According to verse 21, it says, Then Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah, his daughter, to Moses, and she bore him a son. He called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. Can you believe it? A man with an advanced knowledge of science, literature, military tactics, and here he is eking out a very simple existence on the backside of the desert, living with his wife's family, raising a couple of boys, and watching over his father-in-law's sheep. Moses entered the desert at the age of 40. And he didn't leave the desert until he was 80 years old. So during what most people would have considered the most productive years of a person's life, Moses tended sheep in what must have seemed like hell's backyard. He was a man who did not become productive for God until he's 80 years old. According to the account of Acts chapter 7, the life of Moses can be divided into 3 40-year segments. The first 40 years he was nursed by his mother and educated in the courts of Pharaoh. The second 40 years he spent in the desert being taught by God, and the final 40 years he spends with the Hebrew people in the wilderness. Dwight L. Moody paraphrased it this way. He said Moses spent his first 40 years thinking he was a somebody. He spent his second 40 years learning he was a nobody. He spent his final 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. So Moses is now entering the second aspect of his schooling, God's school of the desert. Perhaps you've taken some courses in this school of the desert as well. The desert is a place of desolation. Some people spend a few weeks in the wilderness there. For others, it's months. Moses walked this barren land for 40 years. Our wilderness experiences are all different. The desert can wear any number of faces. It can be crowded with people and yet be a very lonely place. God's schooling includes some time in the wilderness because sometimes that is where he is best able to get our attention. Sometimes God has to take us to the barren wilderness places before he can teach us what we need to learn. When faced with the time in the wilderness, we're prone to offer one of 3 responses. The first response is, I don't need this. My spouse may need it, my sister may need it, my neighbor may need it, but I certainly don't need this wilderness stuff. The second response to being in the wilderness is, I'm tired of it. No matter how long we have to be in the desert experience, it seems like it's too long. But Moses remained in the desert for 40 years. Do you ever feel like saying, Lord, I'm tired of this situation? I'm tired of this person, this circumstance. I've had it up to here with it. I want out of this place now. Have you ever felt like that? And then there's a third response. The response that God is waiting to hear from us. Here I am, Lord. What is it that you want me to learn? What is it that you want me to do? You will never be ready to graduate from the school of the desert until you're able to respond to God in that way. Here I am. Do with me what you want. God never does anything in our lives without a purpose. God put Moses through 40 years in the wilderness and then had him turn right around and lead the children of Israel for 40 more years in the desert. Moses had a 40-year course studying survival in the wilderness so that he would know how to lead a whole nation through a similar wilderness. Why does God lead us through these desert places? Moses himself tells us it is so that God can humble us and test us in order that the true condition of our heart might be revealed. It's not so that God can know us. He already knows all about us. It's so we can know ourselves. Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 2 says, "And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not." God taught Moses some important lessons in the desert that he could not have taught him anywhere else. The first thing I want us to consider is that God taught Moses how to deal with the failures of his past. He taught him how to deal with the memories of those failures. As Moses marched off into the desert, his heart was heavy with regret. Have you ever been truly disappointed with yourself and your actions? Have you ever felt like you messed up so badly that you feel that it's hopeless and it can never be fixed? Well, I believe that Moses felt that way about himself as he leaves and heads for the desert of Midian. He must have believed that God could now never use him for anything, and he would not ever use him again. God used the years in the wilderness to teach Moses to forgive himself. Can you imagine what the 40 years guiding the whole nation of Israel through the wilderness would have been like if Moses had not learned to first forgive himself so that he could forgive others? The second important thing that God taught Moses in the school of the desert was how to handle monotony, how to wait upon God. God is not at all concerned about your concept of time. God is not limited by time. He has his own perfect plan and his own perfect timetable. 40 years in the desert taught Moses how to wait upon God. Another fact here is that God never leaves us alone in the desert. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 10, we read this. It says, "He found him in a desert land, and in that wasteland, a howling wilderness. He encircled him. He instructed him. He kept him as the apple of his eye." Those verses can be personalized for our use. The he there in these verses is God. These verses could say to us today, God found you in a desert land. God found you in a howling wilderness. God encircled you, he instructed you, and kept you as the apple of his eye, literally the pupil of his eye. When we find ourselves in a wilderness experience, we feel that either God has abandoned us or he doesn't care. Neither of that, of course, is true. But before giving in to the feelings of abandonment, we need to take a closer look at these verses from Deuteronomy chapter 32. These verses tell us four things that God does for us. First, he encircles us. Second, he instructs us. Thirdly, he cares for us. And fourth, he guards us as his children. The apple of his eye. I'm very protective of my eyes, and so are you. We don't like to have anything poked in our eye. A lot of people can't wear contact lenses because they just can't get used to putting something in their eye. We protect our eye. We're very protective of them, and that's the point. God shields us with the greatest of care. God has neither abandoned us nor forsaken us in the desert. We are the apple of his eye. He protects us. In the two verses that follow, verse 10, we're given the fifth and final thing that God does for us in our wilderness experience, and that is that he guides us. The verse says, as an eagle stirs up its nest, hovers over its young, spreading out its wings, taking them up, carrying them on its wings. So the Lord alone led him. Although we feel like we're alone in our wilderness experiences, we're not. Charles Swindoll, in his book Moses, A Selfless Dedication, writes this. He says, whether we have known it or not, felt it or not, even believed it or not, God has taken his hand off your life. It's dry. It's lonely. You feel dismal and sad. But whatever your emotions may be telling you, the Bible says you are not alone. You are not alone. Just based on what we have read thus far, we might be tempted to think that the life of Moses ended in obscurity. But in spite of the appearances, God is very much at work in our lives, as we see in the final verses of this chapter. In verse 23, we're told, now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. It's highly probable that Moses, even though he's hidden away in the wasteland of the Midian desert, he still heard about the plight of the Hebrew people at this point. His heart must have ached to do something to help them. But this time he did not go charging back on his own. He waited and he rested and he relied on God. Verse 24 tells us, so God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. Humanly speaking, it looked as though everything was working against Israel. But our text uses four verbs to record the depth of God's response to the groanings and the cries of his people. He heard, he remembered, he looked, and he acknowledged. He was concerned about them. The facts are that God was very informed, very involved, and very much intent on fulfilling his promises and his purposes for the nation of Israel. Well, very quickly, let's just look at the application here. Friend, if you find yourself in God's school of the desert, don't despair. God has a purpose for you being there. God does not do anything without a purpose. God has some things that he wants you to learn. Could it be that, like Moses, you need to learn to deal with some of past memories, past failures? You need to learn to put them in the past and leave them there. Perhaps you've received the forgiveness of God, the forgiveness of others, but you've never forgiven yourself. You keep beating upon yourself for past mistakes and shortcomings. It's time to put it all in the past. God never forgets his promises. Remember, there are no shortcuts through the wilderness desert. It's time to stop running. Stop running from one dead end to another and wait upon God until God decides it's time. It's here in the desert that you will learn things that you will not learn anywhere else. Trust God to do his work in your life, in his timing. God bless. Have a wonderful day, and until we meet again, let's continue to exchange prayers daily.